Hi, you're looking at a stored procedure that I'll be demonstrating in class, but I wanted to do a recorded lecture so that you'd have this information handy when you work on the next part of this project, just so you have access to it and can go back and maybe hear some of these details explained a second time. So let me tell you a little bit about the stored procedure, how it works. First of all, it's designed to accept an input parameter value at runtime, and that value is expected to be the name of a table that is in the HRSQL database. Now yours probably named HRSQL, mine's named HRSQL2, and it's just slightly different, but nevertheless the stored procedure should work with your database equally well. So it'll accept a parameter value that represents a table name, and if we look over here in my database at the tables that exist, you'll notice that there are tables, and then there are tables with similar names that have underscore backup appended. And that's the way it is for all the tables. There's an actual table that contains the normal data, and then what I've done is back that data up into a second table so that if I want to do something experimentally and don't want to run the risk of damaging the data in the original table, I have the ability to work with a test set of data. So understand that every table has a corresponding backup table, and understand the way that's named. They're all named in a similar manner. And so this program is designed to delete whatever table name the user inputs, and I've got it designed so that it will only allow tables with an underscore backup to be deleted. So I'm trying to protect myself so that I don't damage any of my original tables. Okay, so here's the way it works. You'll notice that the stored procedure header is accepting a value through a parameter called @backup table name, and it is using a try-catch block. Okay, so if anything goes wrong, the program will recover from it and provide a printed message so it can sort of monitor what happens in the process. There's some of the usual commands that SQL Server embeds in the stored procedure. And then I have two variables being declared. One's called row count, and what this is going to do is eventually check and see if a table exists in my database that matches the name of the input parameter value. And if it does, then it'll attempt to delete the table. It will delete the table. And if the table doesn't exist, then the SQL will just simply be bypassed. So I'll do a row count of tables, table names that match my input parameter, and if I find there's a value of 1, that means go ahead and delete it. I also have a variable called @SQL statement, and this is being used to create a dynamic SQL command that I can then execute with a statement called the execute statement. Okay, and we'll see how that works. But in the course of running this script, it's going to create a dynamic SQL statement and then execute that variable through an execute statement. It'll execute that dynamic statement through an execute statement. Since I'm going to be counting with this variable row count, I'm initializing it to 0, and then I introduce a new SQL statement the select into statement. And what this does is it takes the data from an existing table, whatever table is specified in the from clause, and it builds a table by whatever name I specify here, and it copies all the data from the original table into this table that it creates. And so what I'm doing is I'm getting data from a system table. Now, we haven't actually looked at this, but there's a table called sys.tables that contains a listing of all the tables in the database. Okay, so the system maintains a table with a list of all tables that have been created, and I'm querying this in order to get the names of all the tables, and I put that list of names in my own newly created table called tab list. And sys.tables has one column. That column is named name, and so when it builds this table called tab list, it's going to create it with one column. It's going to be a structure that's identical to sys.tables, and it too will have a column called name. Now, here's some comment statements that I'm closing up because I need to take those out. I redesigned the program a little bit, and the select statement that I previously had created is the delete statement that I had previously created is no longer of any use, so you can just ignore that. The next statement that executes is going to be a list of all the rows and all the columns in the tab list table. So after it builds that table, I'm just projecting everything that's in it, doing a table dump through a select statement, so that when I run the stored procedure, I can actually view what's in tab list. Okay, so that could be taken out. There's nothing special about it, but just so I can see what's going on, monitor what's happening, I do a raw dump of what's in the tab list table that I just created in the select into. Then I have a print statement, and I actually used this when I was debugging, and if you want to analyze that and even get rid of the comment notation, make it a live print statement, feel free. But all I'm doing is checking to see how to reference the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters of every file name. And so I need to grab a substring that is the last 5 characters, what I said, 2, 4, 6, the last 7 characters of the file names. So I'm really trying to be able to look at the last characters in order to find out whether they say _backup, because what I'm going to do next is, from that table of names that I created, I'm going to delete all of the table names that do not end with _backup. Okay, so when I get to this point, my table has been cleaned up, and it's only filtering names of backup tables. All the other tables are going to be eliminated from the list. So I'm going to have a table listing of all the backup and only the backup tables. And then I display it again, display tab list again, just to see whether it's doing what I want it to do. So the highlighted select statement and the previous select statement here could be taken out. They're not really doing anything. I'm just leaving those in just to see what's going on, just to monitor things. So at this point, I have a table called tab list that contains a listing of all my backup tables, and then I execute an SQL statement, okay, and count the number of tables in the list that have a name that matches my input parameter. And I would anticipate if there's a table that matches my input parameter, that it would be in tab list on a single row, and therefore, if the table exists, it should be populating at row count with a value of 1. Now, if the user inputs a table name, misspelled or otherwise that doesn't match one of the existing backup table names, then row count is going to be populated with a value of 0. In the next part of this, I check to see if row count equals 1. That means go ahead and build a dynamic SQL statement to drop the table. So what I'm doing is creating a drop table SQL data definition language statement. Okay, so this is a statement that actually, instead of manipulating the data within tables, manipulates the table structure itself. And so I'm going to get rid of that table. This will create a string that would read, in this case, drop table, and then it would specify the table name that I want to drop, which would be equivalent to the input parameter value. So it's going to create that string, custom make a SQL statement, and assign it to this text variable. Then I print it out just so I can verify that the SQL is working. And as a matter of fact, when I created this program, I left the execute statement out or commented it out, and ran it, printed, examined what was going on before I tried executing. So I would encourage you, especially where you're doing something destructive like dropping tables or deleting rows of data in tables, that if you're building a dynamic SQL string like this, that you don't execute it on the very first trial run, that you just print it out, make sure it is creating the string the way you think it should, and then you can use the variable name that contains the SQL string with a execute statement, and this is going to actually execute in this case, the drop table command. So if the table exists, the value in row count is going to be 1. It's going to build a string to drop a table by the name that the user has provided, and then it's going to execute that custom SQL, that dynamic SQL string. Otherwise, it's going to take the else path and just print out a message that says whatever the name of the table is doesn't exist. And that's the end of the try block. If anything goes wrong, there's the catch block, and then the stored procedure ends. So again, you'll have access to this stored procedure, and you can copy and paste code from it to build the part of the program that you have to build. I've tried to document it sufficiently so that you can refresh your memory on what's going on. And then I've also tried to give you an overview of most of the SQL statements that are used as part of that script. Okay, now let's take a look and see how this works. So I'll go ahead and close up the editor window here, and because of the way I've written the program code, I will need to delete this table called tab list. Okay, so among my tables there's tab list, and this is the table. Let me just open it up here. Select top 1,000 rows. This is my, at this point, filtered list of table names. Okay, so that was extracted from a system table and then cleaned up with some of the program code in the stored procedure. And in order to run that stored procedure, there's a select into statement that builds a table called tab list, and one of the conditions that are necessary in using the select into statement is that there not be a table by the table name that it's creating in existence in your database. So if I leave this in here, the select into statement will not work. So I'm going to have to manually delete this. Now I do something different in the second program. So I wrote the stored procedure that you will have to write as the second part of this project, and when I wrote it, I dealt with this issue by dropping the tab list table within the stored procedure. But in this case, I have to drop it manually, and then if I let me see what I've got here in the way of a table. I am going to, I've got a table called dud backup that I will delete, and I'm going to create another table called dud. Alright, so just so I have something to work with here, I'm going to create a new table. I'll call this dud, and say OK to that. Close the window, refresh the folder, and now you're going to see that there's a new table called dud, and there's also dud backup. Now this stored procedure will allow me to delete tables that have a underscore backup name, but unless they end with those 7 characters, the stored procedure shouldn't permit any other table to be deleted. That way I don't accidentally delete one of my good tables. Alright, so I'm going to run the stored procedure here. And I'll try to delete the dud table. Now this shouldn't work, shouldn't delete anything, so I'm going to say OK to that. And if you recall, there were a couple of SQL statements where I just echoed out the names of the files that were stored away in the table. So the first listing you saw was the raw listing of table names, and here's then the filtered listing of table names. And if I switch to the message page, it says dud table does not exist. Okay, now dud table actually exists, but it doesn't exist in that filtered list in the table named tab list, so it doesn't exist in tab list. And if I go back to the object bar, refresh the table folder and look, there's dud, nothing happened to it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close up this window. I'm going to run the stored procedure again, and before I do that I have to remember to delete tab list manually. So I don't know what I just did. Let me try that again. So going to delete tab list and execute the stored procedure again. This time I'm going to delete dud backup. Okay, so since it ends with those 7 characters underscore backup, it should delete this table. Again, executes the 2 SQL statements, and then over here it tells me that it's going to drop dud backup table. So that's the print statement that's printing that dynamic SQL. and that's the actual command that's being executed through the execute statement. And if I go back to the table folder, I see dud backup existing until I refresh, and then dud backup is no longer there. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and I'll get this video on YouTube so that you can watch it a time or two as you work on the next part of this project.